All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I am excited to be here with David Helene on the end and Aaron Smith. David Helene is from Beam. Aaron Smith is from Savi. These are two companies that have decided to take on one of the biggest challenges that are facing students in higher education, and that is how the heck are they going to pay for it? It's definitely a challenge that some of us think maybe shouldn't exist. You know, if we think that education is the cornerstone of a effective and just society, it begs the question why we make it so expensive to actually go to college. But nonetheless, here we are. Today, the average tuition and room and board to attend a four-year college is about $28,000 a year. It adds up to over $100,000 for your four-year experience. My parents' home in rural Pennsylvania is valued just about that point. So, you know, these are very large expenses that people are making and people are putting into their education. And it's really no wonder that, you know, there are surveys that have come out in recent years saying that as many as 50% of students in two-year colleges and 30% of students in four-year colleges live with food insecurity while they attend college. And it's really no wonder that we now have about 43 million individuals who are carrying student loan debt that they have taken out to finance their education. And there have been lots of headlines about recent efforts to forgive loans and get them off the books for some folks, but these solutions are going to still leave us with a staggering number of people who carry student loans, despite these efforts. So these founders have stepped boldly into what I think many of us can think of and would describe as a bit of a mess in terms of financing and paying for higher education. And I'm really excited to hear how these individuals and these companies are bringing technology to solve the problems. I think that what they've really finding is that technology is absolutely essential to meet the problem and the scale of the problem that we're working with here. And so I'm excited to dig into their solutions. I'm going to start with the experience of paying for school when you're in it. How can we better support students while they are enrolled? During the pandemic, there was a very widely distributed program called the Higher Education Emergency, it was HERF, Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Got it. This was a fund that was made available in three different waves, and WGU actually participated in Wave 2 and Wave 3. We did a pretty thorough analysis of our distributions. We distributed this funding, and it was millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars that we distributed in a range of programs. And we did some analysis on this. We learned two very important things from this analysis. First, that in fact, a great many of our students do struggle financially. When we sent out a survey to students receiving this funding, of those who reported back to us, more than 50% said that they were struggling to pay their utility bills, they were struggling to pay their food bills, they were struggling to pay their housing bills. More than 50% of the people that we got the survey back from, we distributed that funding to 10,000 students. This is not a small number of students on in our learning programs. The second thing we learned is that actually giving them money helped. We saw an 11 percentage point increase in the retention or in the graduation rates after about 12 months of after they've received this funding. So the money helped. You know, I don't know why we act surprised. We shouldn't be, but it's nonetheless kind of an important finding. So David, tell us about what Beam has been doing in the world of emergency aid and how you've brought technology to help solve this problem.
Absolutely, and thank you, Bethany. So HERF was actually about a 10-year manifestation of a lot of hard work that had come before that. So as Bethany alluded to, there were three waves of emergency relief funding, $32 billion, but it was a one-time event. What had preceded it was about a decade of really hard grassroots work across campuses all over the country, where we were seeing that students were dealing with financially induced dropout, which before the pandemic, where mental health has since eclipsed it, was the #1 reason that students were dropping out. you had a lot of really hardworking student affairs professionals and presidents and just leaders who saw their students struggling and were doing whatever they could to try to piece together money to help these students stay enrolled. So you had a lot of these grassroots efforts across what is actually definitionally a complex program journey. So if you think about emergency aid, it consists of an application. There's identity verification. Does a student actually, is a student enrolled here? There's eligibility determination. There's possibly case management. There's a payment, and then there's some sort of reporting. And typically this has been done across fragmented systems, fragmented individuals, sometimes through a committee where folks are reviewing a student's application once every 2 weeks. And what you have seen is that these programs actually historically were found not to be effective. And we know that that runs counter to pretty much every empirical study that's ever been done about giving people money around public policy outcomes. So Beam's thesis is that these programs are effective, but what's really important is ensuring that the administration of these programs is effective as well. So we have developed an end-to-end solution that consists of a research-based application, the ability to engage in identity verification, quick research-based eligibility determination, case management, payment, and reporting, where we have been able to pay students on average between 18 and 24 hours of actually applying, and we've seen, similar to what WGU has seen, that we've been able to help increase graduation rates by as much as 8 to 11 percentage points across different partners of ours. So we are really focused on helping institutions ensure that the administrative infrastructure is there to make sure we're not getting these null effects.
Great. So I'm going to turn to you now, Aaron. So Savi and Labs did some research together. And this research, we did a national survey of student loan borrowers, or student borrowers. And what we learned is just how far into the lives and the adult lives and continuing lives of individuals these loans reach even after they've graduated, long after they've graduated. Among the findings that we found really striking was that large numbers of individuals were saying that they were delaying key and critical financial milestones in their lives, things like starting a retirement account, making investments, the kinds of things that set you up for long-term financial wellness. They were also putting off personal milestones, the kinds of things that actually kind of give your life richness and fulfillment: getting married, starting families, buying a house, moving out of your parents' house, all of these things. And it was just really incredible to see what we started calling the long tail of student loans. So tell us about Savi and the solutions you're bringing into the mix to deal with student loans.
Sure. So you can think of Savi as TurboTax for student loans. We have a platform that helps borrowers navigate all these complicated government programs that are out there. And why is that necessary? It's because we have almost $2 trillion of student loan debt. 90% of it is held by the federal government, and it operates by rules that are totally unlike any other type of consumer debt. So there are programs that will forgive your loans after a period of time. There are programs that will limit your monthly payments based on your income. There are programs for FFEL loans, and there are programs for Parent Plus loans, and every single type of program has different qualifications, has different paperwork, has different rules, and it's a total maze. And unlike doing your taxes, where you could go to an accountant or you could use TurboTax, there really doesn't exist very much that could actually help people navigate this maze. And so that's why we created Savi. We work with hundreds of employers, universities, membership groups to provide this essentially as a benefit to their employees or students or customers. And so our average user reduces their monthly payment by about $150 a month. If they're in the public sector, let's say they're a teacher, their average they're finding about $30,000 in potential loan forgiveness. So it's pretty massive. Just think of, there's literally hundreds of billions of dollars in potential savings out there that people just don't know about and they don't take advantage of. And so we were, really excited to do the research with WGU, because one of the theories that we've had for a long time is just that student debt is holding people back from all these other beneficial things in their life. There was some research that came out recently that showed that people were, when payments recently resumed in October, people reduced their retirement contributions by about 2.5%. So immediately, that money comes, you were using it for other things. I have student loan debt. I did not make payments during the pause. And now all of a sudden my payments start again. That money has to come from somewhere. And for a lot of people, that comes from what would go into retirement or saving for a house or a million other things that we want people to do. So we're trying to unlock that opportunity, or even going back to school. One of the things we focus on is it's about 40% of student loan borrowers have debt but no degree. And one of our theories is that a lot of people would go back and complete, but it's very hard to say to someone, yeah, go back to school, when they're already sitting on that debt and they're already trying to pay back that debt. So if we can help people navigate that and get out of debt, it might increase the chance they could actually go back and complete. So that's a little bit of what we do.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that the reason technology needed to come into the scene here is because these are tremendously complicated systems that need, kind of rapid computation. They need to be able to reach and engage people quickly, easily, and at scale. So thinking now about technology over the last two years, we've certainly heard plenty about the growing influence of AI technology, large language models, machine learning. Are these solutions, are these technologies, and are you thinking about these technologies as being able to kind of amp up your impact and reach? And in what ways? Can they or might they be game changers?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. First, I want to be clear that none of these are new technologies. They're just rapid evolutions in a technology stack that does offer a lot of exciting opportunities. Bethany, you mentioned the higher education emergency relief funding. Again, there's been a massive body of research on the issue of student basic needs for a long time, right? For over a decade, some of the statistics that Bethany cited, issues around food insecurity, around housing insecurity, there was a niche audience for that message, and that message has been growing, which is really encouraging. So we are starting to see really intentional investments, mostly at the state level, but you're seeing investments like in California or in Oregon, where the state has invested in a basic needs coordinator on every campus, on the community colleges in the case of California, and at both 2- and 4-year institutions in Oregon, and that's amazing. But then you take a step back and you think about there's a single person responsible for helping folks with resource referral and benefits enrollment at campuses that may be as large as 50,000 students. And now you have a real problem because you have an individual who's having to somehow deal with a caseload that is completely unsustainable. So as we think about natural language processing and how we might be able to apply these technologies here around financial insecurity, we're thinking about areas of, are we able to summarize student history of interaction across an institution, thinking about what type of resources a student may have sought after or may have engaged in to summarize that those interaction points for a case manager so that they're not necessarily starting from scratch if they're interacting with a student. We are also thinking about how can we proactively refer students to resources. This is actually something that we're seeing a lot of institutions do. There's the founder of InmidHub, or Mainstay, I think is wandering around here. They've been doing chatbot work for referring students to resources for a long time. But certainly as these language models are improving, there's a lot better work that can be done to proactively refer students to housing resources, to food resources, and of course to rapidly screen students for emergency aid.
Yeah, I would just piggyback off that and give the example of student debt. Most colleges, I think, want to help their graduates deal with the student debt that they give them. They have programs, they have exit loan counseling, they may have, services that follow up and actually will call people after they graduate, but it's extremely limited. Most students are basically on their own. And I think it's largely because schools do not have the resources to be following up, certainly in the kind of very manual, kind of on the phone way that a lot of that work is done. And so, you also have to think about the modern student body. A lot of students, they don't want to pick up the phone. They don't want to talk, they don't want to call into a number. They want to do something on their phone. They want to be able to do it at whatever time fits their schedule. And that's one of the things that technology is great at. For Savi, about 50% of our users do it all on their phone. And so I think this idea of you still need that kind of person-to-person connection for a lot, but this idea that technology can help to expand your reach, scale up those kinds of education programs, help people who don't want to talk to a person on the phone, they want to kind of, self-service. I think there's a big need there. Also, I would just say, when we started Savi, the student loan system was and continues to be incredibly antiquated. I remember having to fax my forms in to my servicer for public service loan forgiveness and not having any idea where to find a fax machine. It's just like things that in any other consumer context would be, crazy, at least in this world, was still very kind of antiquated. And so trying to bring that student loan world into the 21st century is one of our goals.
And just to piggyback on something you said, Aaron, it's also not necessarily just that students may not want to call. It could be that they fundamentally can't, right? If you think about the percentage of students who work, right, who are holding 1 to 2 jobs, we see in our own data from students who apply for emergency aid that over 30% of them are doing so between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning. Right, so these are students who are dealing with very complex lives with a lot of obligations, where a physical sort of interaction point or even a phone call may be just too much of a burden for them to be able to take on. So to your point, Aaron, just really need to meet them where they are.
There are a couple of university administrators in the room that I can see, and I'm sure they're wondering when you would anticipate these the natural language processing models and tools to be available. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're already available. But do you mean at a quality that we can rely on and trust?
That you would put in front of
universities? I'm loath to make predictions at the rate of progress on artificial intelligence. Anthropic released a new model today, right? So, the rate of change on these large language models is pretty dramatic. And I would take a guess that you will see a lot of education companies coming out with or advertising AI models that will do some of these things. The quality of which I cannot attest to, but I think you will see a proliferation of solutions that are speaking to some of these use cases.
Only thing I'd add is I think that this point, we're always going to be very cautious about anything that gives information to students because of these quality concerns. I think there may be intermediate steps, though. For example, one of the challenges that we see is people will get these extremely complicated letters from the Department of Ed and the servicers describing what they're supposed to do with their student loans. And half the time, our users, and we have hundreds of thousands of users, will simply forward this to us and say, what does this mean? And so the ability to take something like that is fairly structured and translate it for a user to say, hey, this is what this means. These are the 3 things you actually need to do when you see a letter like this. Those are the kind of things that I think in the short term, AI is very well suited to, and that we're starting to experiment with.
Did you have more?
No, I think it's a great example, and using AI, you can literally prompt ChatGPT or others to do it as if I'm a 5th grader, right? Explain it to me as if I'm a 3rd grader, which allows for much more accessibility in how you're able to process this information.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm gonna jump into a sort of a new direction here. We were gathered here to talk about technology solutions for financial aid and support, but I'm going to ask you, what are the limits of tech? What of the problems that you're taking on, and you all are taking on very big problems in financial aid and support for students, do we just, like, we are not going to have a technology solution for, and we need to kind of build a different kind of coalition around it?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first this time. I think there are a couple pieces of this. We can have there might be a future question on what is driving the cost of higher ed and student debt. And those are really incredibly challenging things. I'm based in DC, actually, and my background is on higher education policy. And there's lots of proposals to sort of bring down student debt in a more permanent way, not the kind of, most of the solutions that are being proposed are more sort of short-term solutions. What are the more permanent solutions? I think that's, those are still years away. So what can we do to actually help people right now? I think solutions like, partnering with employers. For example, people talk a lot about people with $100,000+ in student loan debt, like many of the people I went to law school with, for example. But that's not really who's most at risk of defaulting on their student loans or falling behind. It's people with much lower debt levels who should qualify for programs like SAVE. I don't know how many of you hear about the new income-driven plan called SAVE. It's really the most generous program that has ever existed for borrowers. If you make under $32,000 a year, you'd pay $0 a month. Everyone who could qualify really should be in this program, but those are the hardest people to reach. And the government will do all these efforts to try to get the word out, but a lot of these folks, they're working hourly. Their closest thing, they may be disconnected from their school. The closest thing they may have is their employer. And so we're thinking a lot about, could these kind of public-private partnerships between universities and the employers get some of this information into the hands of these borrowers who could really, really benefit enormously. And I think those are sort of more innovative solutions that we could be implementing right now.
Yes. So as we think about Beam's mission, certainly part of our mission is to improve the efficacy of these programs, but the other piece of it is to increase the supply. So if you think about the supply and the demand of emergency aid, those two things are not close to one another. So what is really required is data collection, research, and advocacy, and that is certainly a piece of how we think about these issues. So if we were to go back to candidate Biden, not this cycle, but in 2019, the American Families Plan, as designed, was meant to have a $62 billion investment into student success initiatives that were rigorously evidence-based. Once that got to the budget reconciliation process, that got whittled down to $9 billion of investment into student success that would include emergency aid. And in its final passage, it is now $500 million over 7 years, which is basically $4 a student. So we are not investing into these programs at a federal level, and there certainly is no congressional capital for this right now. So as we think about how we can address some of the structural issues that we're facing, we are looking more at a state-by-state sort of advocacy coalition, where a key piece of what we do is we are able to track real-time data around how students are experiencing these problems, because being able to speak to the prevalence of the issue demonstrates the need for some sort of solution. So as we were showing efficacy, we were also showing prevalence. We have been fortunate to be able to share de-identified data with the White House and the Department of Education, and we certainly are doing that with partners across the country as we think about state legislative advocacy campaigns. So the vastness of this problem is so large that we really do need to think about what structural investments we can make, and we think that there are structural investments that can be made on a state-by-state basis.
Can I add one more thing on this point? One of the, it's worth pointing out some of the positive improvements that have happened on student loans as one example. So public service loan forgiveness. If you work in the public sector, so nonprofit, government, many healthcare, teaching, it should qualify. You're eligible to have your loans forgiven after 10 years. For a long time, that program was a disaster. Something like, you may have heard a stat, 99% of people who applied got rejected from that program. How could that be? A program that was so well-intentioned could be? It was because they had built in so many sort of traps for consumers, technicalities, people who would apply who didn't realize, oh, actually you had to consolidate those loans and now your clock starts all over. Or actually you submitted in the wrong way. You weren't in the right type of repayment plan. There was just a million ways that people could get caught up. And so when we got started, one of our first big partners was the NEA, the big teacher union. And we would talk to teachers all the time, say, this program is not real. This is not something that can really help, because I know a million people, they've tried applying and they always get rejected. And one of the good things that has happened is they have made meaningful improvements to the program so that now they've taken some of those traps out. So people are applying and they're actually getting forgiveness. And the rules are clear. And you know, they've made it a little more relaxed. If you didn't have the exact type of loan, they would allow you, as long as it was a government loan, to count those credits. So, you know, it's not perfect. I think now the denial rate is like 50%. But that's quite a bit better than, you know, the 99% rate that we had. So there are things like that that I think the government can do to make these programs easier for consumers, more consumer friendly, and it really can make a huge impact in people's lives.
Actually, to that point, the Biden-Harris administration released an executive order, I believe last year, that mandated that the executive agencies streamline how consumers are able to access various forms across the government. So this has been a thematic effort that the federal government has been making, is to try to simplify these processes to reduce administrative burden for folks.
But that's all great to hear, actually. Anytime the government can be more streamlined, I think we would all cheer. And so clearly the government needs to be one of the sort of members of the coalition here. Erin, you identified employers. David, do you see employers as an important player in the emergency aid space?
Interestingly, employers themselves are starting to put together emergency aid programs. So, you know, as worker financial health is deteriorating, employers are increasingly starting to see that this is partially their problem. So we're seeing a lot similar to what we saw in the education space probably 5 to 10 years ago. We're seeing a lot of these grassroots programs that are popping up that our employers are putting together. I'm very interested to see how that theme continues, particularly as the lines between sort of workforce and post-secondary continue to bleed into one another, as we think about shorter, cheaper pathways, as we think about technical training programs. I'm curious how sort of wraparound supports and emergency aid are able to sort of be a standard part of these types of programs. So I think employers will increasingly be part of this. I don't know the structural nature of that, but they certainly are doing more in the employee financial health realm.
And I know that both of you have talked about sort of the higher ed role, obviously plays a big role here, and the support for students in higher ed, sort of transitioning from you know, a really kind of hands-on, you know, high-touch approach to something that it's going to be more responsive, more agile, and more effective. Can you say more about kind of like where you see the role of the higher ed agencies and how they would change their work in order to be more effective in this space?
Yeah, so I just specifically on student loans, you know, what we see when we talk to universities is typically, you know, they are federally mandated to do exit loan counseling. And so sometimes that can be meaningful. In many cases, that's pretty superficial. Then universities can be concerned and should be concerned about their, you know, the rate at which their students are repaying their loans. Sometimes that can have negative consequences if they're not repaying their loans. And some universities will take affirmative steps to try to help people avoid default on their student loans, for example. And so you have many universities who will hire firms to help them, you know, calling students and things like that. But really so that's sort of one population. And then you have, I'd say in the other bucket, universities that have programs to raise money off their students. And there's always something a little ironic when, you know, you have students who are burdened with student loan debt who start to get those solicitations from their, you know, university to say, hey, you know, have you thought about donating? But I think that some of these technology solutions can help to bridge the gap where, where we're see, okay, can you supplement your education efforts for your graduates with technology tools that can help them enroll in programs like SAVE or find out about other repayment options that can get them on track to forgiveness. And then long term, I think that does build more of a feeling among students that the school is committed to my success. And I think we'll end up making the students more likely to give back and more kind of loyal to the school. I think there are things that could move in Congress that could put sort of all schools on notice for outcomes in a much bigger way. And I think if something like that were to happen, that could be pretty transformative in terms of how higher ed views, their students. And right now, I think there are some efforts to make sure students are on track afterwards, but it tends to be fairly limited.
Bethany, you mentioned state higher education agencies, and I think what's really interesting about those agencies is, they are a state government agency, and it's often the case that post-secondary sort of treats itself like a silo. So if we think about students, increasingly the demographics of the modern student, students are people like us. They are, they're usually above 25 years old. They're working 1 to 2 jobs. Often they are folks that need access to the traditional social safety net. So one of the interesting things that we've started to see among some of the leading education agencies, I'll give the example of WASAC in Washington. Now, Washington is one of the most progressive states in the country. They have by far the most general state-based financial aid policy in the country, but they have started coordinating with their Department of Health and Human Services, whereby anyone who is automatically eligible for SNAP is automatically eligible for the State Financial Aid Award. So there are, you were talking, Aaron, about administrative burden, right? Just the immense strain of having to get through these unbelievably convoluted and complex forms. We'll multiply that, right? Think about it's not just the FAFSA, potentially an additional state financial aid form. It's also a SNAP form. It's a TANF form. It's a WIC form. There are states that are starting to understand that they can think about data sharing agreements and start to try to make it easier to enroll students across these programs and taking a more holistic approach to how we support the individuals in our communities. So actually one of the expansions of BEAM in the last 2 years is in acknowledging this sort of identity of the modern student. We ourselves have actually started to partner with states, with local governments, to administer programs like rental assistance, utility assistance, like SNAP, TANF, WIC. And we're seeing really encouraging efforts among certain governments to try to break down these silos. I know Colorado has been working for years on a very complex interagency data sharing agreement across not just higher education, but 6 other agencies, including labor, I believe it's workforce development in Colorado, as well as health and human services, post-secondary, et cetera. So I think more and more of these efforts are needed. I think more and more of these efforts actually become much easier with some of the technologies that we described as we think about translating really old, disparate data languages that requires some significant translation. But that is an evolution step that we're starting to see and that we're hoping to see more of in the next couple of years.
I'm going to transition to Q&A, but before I do that, I have one last question for both of you. How will you know you're having the impact that you've sought a year from now, 3 years from now? What are you looking for?
One thing I didn't mention is this is a very strange time in student loans. Payments were paused for 3 years, and they started up again in October. And some of the recent data showed that 40% of borrowers did not make a payment, that first payment. So a lot of people are not yet sort of back in the habit of making payments. The government has created some, they call it an on-ramp period, where they're not penalizing you immediately for not making payments. That is supposed to end this fall, meaning that by this fall, if you're not making payments, that could start hitting your credit. You could start to go in the path to our default on student loans. So that's something that we are very concerned about and sort of tracking very closely. And once upon a time, not too long ago, well over 10% of people who had student loan debt were in default on their student loans. And so I think we will be tracking that very closely, make sure that everyone who needs help is able to find out about these programs, get enrolled into these programs. And so that, that is at least one metric that we're going to be tracking closely.
I think for us, I mean, certainly we always look at retention and graduation rates about immediate impact, but if we think about structural impact, we have a unique ability to try to help catalyze structural policy reform. So we're actually in implementation right now of the state of Minnesota. To their credit, they passed one of the most progressive budgets in the country last May, which included, for the first time, a $10 million investment into emergency aid across the Minnesota state system. And there's real appetite there to continue to support basic needs for students. They actually put together a legislatively authorized task force to evaluate what they might do to improve student basic needs year over year. So for us, we want to be able to see communities that we're working with make incremental investments into these programs, and that would be a real marker of success.
Thanks to you both. I want to open it up for people to ask questions. Oh, we have a lot. There's a mic right there, or you can come take mine.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna bring it right here. So I want to ask you about FAFSA. So before all this, I'm with Intuit, by the way. So we're finding in our research about FAFSA that a lot of students just fill it out inaccurately or don't fill it out at all, and then they get burdened with student debt, partly for that reason. I just want to ask you, like, your diagnosis of the FAFSA process now and what technology solutions could be available to help students out before they get into all this debt.
I know that the rollout of the new FAFSA has not been smooth. I remember, so before Savi, I had started a group called Young Invincibles that worked on, among other issues, healthcare. And I remember the rollout of healthcare.gov. And that was a disaster at the time. But the government, to its credit, got through that. And now there are tens of millions of people who get health insurance coverage through healthcare.gov. So I am hopeful that over time, that some of these issues will kind of work themselves out. That said, at least with student loan debt, I still don't think there's nearly enough education that happens on the front end to help people prevent them from taking on the student loan debt, or to weigh different options, of different schools or programs. And really, I do think that there's more that could happen there from a technology perspective. That's something that we have explored at Savi, and we've had some conversations with partners about, but I've yet to see something really broad in scope that could help students make those kind of determinations, other than everyone, you should fill out the FAFSA.
Yeah, the FAFSA is, it is a beast for anyone who has multiple degrees, much less someone who is dealing with time scarcity and doesn't have every advantage in the world to sit down and spend dedicated time filling it out. I mean, you have seen multiple private entities try to dive into that space, in certain cases to fraud, and in other cases to not correct criminal behavior, but less success. There are a lot of challenges for why it would be difficult for private enterprise to actually take on the FAFSA intentionally. There is a lot that's needed, to your point, on remediation and correction. And once you're feeding it in to ed, that feedback loop is tough, right? So FSA has been going through a multi-year transformational program for many years, where they had this grand vision to try to create a really simplified, I'm sure you know this already, but really simplified experience for families that was a one-stop shop for everything financial aid. It has not been seen through to the vision that was painted. Actually, Wayne Johnson, who was the COO of FSA, gave a talk here, I think in 2018, about what that was going to look like. But it's just such a morass. And the technology that FSA is working with doesn't make it easier or better. But you also need the best kind of UX design, user experience design, how you're thinking about supporting families. So I don't think there's an easy cure-all solution. I think it's going to continue the way that it is. But I also don't think that, given the circumstances, it is wise for private enterprise to step in based on some of the experiences that we've seen.
Hey, Oh, that was way louder than I expected. David, I heard you mention, as you look at public institutions and communities starting to share data, et cetera, as I sat and listened to the two of you talk about two parts of a single problem, access to money and then paying it back, right? It's your two organizations among many who are all solving kind of bits and pieces along the way. So we talk about how state institutions need to be collaborating. What are you seeing in the private side? How are organizations who are solving these pieces helping to make it easy to navigate for administrators and for students as they go along that journey?
It's a really good question. I haven't seen a ton of partnerships among sort of financially focused entities. I mean, unfortunately, to be cynical about it, the very common use case was a student lending company trying to solicit data so that they could try to give loans to consumers. I don't know that many partnerships of companies like ours where we are trying to take pieces of the problem and address it. It's an interesting use case. It gets into a lot of complexities about business models, about certainly data privacy. Now I know we work directly with schools. There are material limitations around what we can do with data based on our need to comply with FERPA and other data sharing requirements. So that does limit some of the things we might do with a company like Savi. But I don't know, Aaron, if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, this is a different space, but there's a lot of interesting things happening in healthcare. For example, with Medicaid managed care plans, where now, just connecting the dots between, if you're eligible for Medicaid, then you're likely eligible for this program, or now, in some states you might be eligible for housing assistance. Mm-hmm. So can we connect all these different things so that, and also it helps the individual not to have to sort of fill out forms with me and fill out forms with you and fill out forms with another provider or fill out forms with a government agency. If sort of there's one entry point and then you get routed based on, whatever you are eligible for. The closest analogy I've seen is in some of these Medicaid managed care plans, but they also have huge financial interests in helping people align in ways that there isn't quite that centralizing force when it comes to education.
Why is that?
I think that healthcare. There are certainly similarities between healthcare and higher, but for example, in Medicaid managed care, if they can bring down costs of their consumers, they can make more money essentially. And I don't know what the analogy would be like that in higher ed, but if you imagine, okay, if I know someone could be at risk of being homeless, well, that might increase their healthcare costs across these other things. So if I can get them into housing, maybe that actually brings down healthcare costs, and the Medicaid managed care plan could actually make more money in that way. You could think about some sort of models like that in higher ed, but I haven't really seen that.
I know I'm not mic'd, so. I mean, this kind of, doesn't it sort of come back to the question you posed or the elephant that you put into the room previously when you said, we're all working around the central problem of a very expensive college degree. And so that's essentially this thing that we're solving lots of problems around because we're not addressing that central thesis. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are proposals, again, that would, for example, incentivize innovation among higher ed institutions to say, hey, if you can get someone a quality education for lower cost, that should actually be in your financial interest, as a university, and push people to be innovative in this kind of way. But I do fear that we are, given the state of Congress and DC and probably divided government for the foreseeable future, anything like that is probably many years away. There could be things at the state level that would kind of drive more innovation in that, but I think that's one of the frustrations people have had with the whole debate around student loan forgiveness, and is that it would, even if it would to happen at the level that we want, it would be a Band-Aid. It wouldn't be a long-term fix, and the cost of college is going to continue to go up.
I'm not a market guy, but I would say that there are a lot of trends right now that suggest to me that the current market basis of pricing is completely unsustainable and will have to course correct even in absence of policy. So if I'm thinking about, there's a recent survey where it found that skepticism among the value of a college degree is the highest it's ever been. And you have that at the same time where you have all these AI tools that create a proliferated access to information and schooling, whether legitimate or not, that could very well displace a lot of opting into post-secondary degrees. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just saying that this is something where you could see a rational actor choosing to forego that cost burden to try to sort of solicit the same types of skills in cheaper, faster ways. I would argue that this has been a trend we've already been seeing, right? I mean, there are innovators in this room, WGU, SNU, who have brought cheaper degree pathways to the market, right? And that has had some sort of impact. I think this is going to be compounded in the next few years as we think about new models for educating, particularly workforce. I'm also really curious to understand how things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, right? These bills have supplemental workforce development and training components, and we have millions and millions of jobs that need to be filled, and these do not all require a four-year degree. So I do think that there are natural market forces that will push some of these averages down just out of necessity based on a lot of the trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So my question is around, it's almost like a last mile problem. You mentioned that a lot of people who would really benefit from programs like these are the ones that are hardest to reach because maybe they don't have access to tech, or they're working multiple jobs, things like that. So how do you kind of bridge that gap between tech-enabled solutions and people who don't necessarily have access to tech?
We had done, this is in my old role at Young Invincibles, we had done a bunch of research on very low income, struggling youth populations, like homeless young people. And one of the things that we found that frankly surprised us was that the problem wasn't necessarily lack of access to a smartphone. Homeless young people, for example, actually had smartphones. They didn't necessarily have, they may have been solely using them for Wi-Fi, for example. But it wasn't so much that they didn't have any tech at all. It was there were no messengers that could get that information into their hands. So they were disconnected from the kind of trusted providers of information. And so it was oftentimes they have access to all kinds of information, but how do you get the information that is actually critical to them? That's why I'm really interested in the employer channel, because that is one place where if you're getting a paycheck, where you actually do have to be checking in with something on a regular basis. And I recently went to a conference all about, for example, how do we help restaurant workers get better access to a range of financial services and help. And it was all about this, overcoming that trust gap as the first step of it. Otherwise, they are just as skeptical even of their employer. But it was less about the technology, and it was more about that, finding the right messenger.
Yeah, I also think the trust gap is going to get a lot worse before it gets better with proliferation of robocalling and deepfakes and all these things. I mean, to Aaron's point, the Robin Hood Foundation's done similar research that's found that access to smartphones for low-income folks is about 90+%, at least in New York City. But the thing that is a huge digital divide is access to broadband. So that's sort of the area that we're looking at closely. I think one of the tragedies of the last couple months is the lapsing of the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, that was providing subsidized broadband access to low-income communities across the country, and that program does not have a renewed funding mandate. So as we think about sort of access to tech, I think that's actually the one is to operate in this new modern climate, you do need 5G, you do need broadband to be able to participate on Zooms and all of these things that require sort of more computing power. So that's one that I think we need to make really targeted investments, if not at the federal level, certainly at the state level. I imagine that would hopefully be part of the infrastructure bill, although I haven't looked closely. But that's what we think about a lot. For us, actually, when you think about emergency aid, reaching folks isn't really the problem. So there are a lot of surveys that are often done where it is true students report not knowing that this resource was available. The tension that we often see among administrators in the higher education space is you can let folks know it exists, but if you do, you're going to get inundated with about 25,000 applications in a day. And you have this new problem of you're saying no to all of these students. So there's this approach due to scarcity of sort of rationing, right, of like how do we do targeted outreach to the students that we think might be the most in need, which is a tough determination to make. So again, this gets back to sort of my original premise of like our goal is to increase supply, because if the supply is there, we know that we can reach folks. And for these types of programs, we would.
We probably have time for one more. Okay.
Not sure that's there it is. Now it's working. I wanted to ask about the role of servicers in all this. So obviously, servicers are going to be a huge point of contact for borrowers with the student loan system, and yet right now we see often 2 to 3 hour hold times for servicers. We see sometimes the people who are answering the phones, they're getting paid $15 an hour. They might not be experts on this, and sometimes they might not be necessarily be giving the best advice to borrowers, so they might not necessarily be getting the borrowers into the repayment plan that they need to be in. I do recall reading a study a while back showing basically once servicer phone reps had access to kind of an AI tool, a chatbot, that really increased the number of borrower problems that they were clearing and increased borrower satisfaction and all that. So I was wondering if you're seeing any movement in this space to help leverage some of these technology solutions to improve the quality of servicing specifically.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So you're right. I mean, servicers have been an issue for a really long time, and it's only gotten worse. I mean, you might have heard about some of the challenges with, you mentioned people being on hold for hours. There were people who the servicer turned their auto payments back on without asking their permission. There were servicers who miscalculated people's payments and told them the wrong thing, or in the case of public service loan forgiveness, told them that they weren't eligible, but they were eligible. It's just every problem you can imagine under the sun. The hard thing when you think about innovation coming out of that sector is, and I've talked to all the servicers, if anything, people are trying to get out of the servicing business. For a long time, there's a company called FedLoan that managed public service loan forgiveness. They got out of it. Navient, which was the biggest servicer, they got out of it. So over the last year or so, millions of people have actually switched from one servicer to another, which was another one of the challenges with payments resuming is you may have gotten a letter from someone saying, hey, you got to start making payments from a company you've never even heard of before. So ultimately, these are government contractors. The government should be holding them accountable and saying, hey, we need certain levels of service. Hey, we want you to update your systems and, make it easier to do these. But I would say it's right now they're just trying to keep their heads above water for the most part. Same thing with processing times. People who submit an application who don't hear back for weeks or even months, like we have to get those processing times down so people have clarity about what they actually owe. So I do think that the Department of Education has proposed more and more things that I think will be helpful. For one, they're proposing moving to a system that's less about the servicers and more about kind of a central place where all borrowers can come to. So it doesn't ultimately matter as much who your servicer is. The department would be a central place. So I'm hopeful that some of those efforts will kind of bring innovation. I think, something like AI, the people will be very conservative about how that is rolled out, but there's certainly potential there.
I know less about the servicer case. I'll only react to the last part. Rationally, I would completely agree with you that caution should be exercised, and you'd expect that caution would be exercised. We do a lot of work in the public benefit space, and I've been shocked at how quickly government agencies are adopting these types of technologies. And they're doing it because it gets to the heart of exactly what you're both describing, which is a lot of these agencies or GovCons are fundamentally understaffed. So in the government workforce, I know at the county level, there's about a 750,000 job deficit of folks they need relative to who they have. And because of that, you have these massive, massive bottlenecks in processing across all types of government programs. So there are SNAP, which is the Food Insecurity Program. There are 5 states that have more than 60-day wait times for people who are living, with food insecurity day in and day out. That's 2 months, right? Think about that. And the reason for that is because these agencies have 30% of the workforce that they need. So AI, good or bad, is being viewed as a lifeline. And there are a lot of agencies that are doing experimentation with exactly what you're describing, right? This kind of co-pilot model, right, of can you summarize things and try to make it easier for the overwhelmed person on the other side of that phone. We're seeing a rush to adopt these technologies. And one of my concerns is, have they been vetted correctly? Do we even know what questions to be asking at this stage of the innovation cycle? Like, how do we even start to think about data sharing? That's something that could take up many panels here. So I would usually agree with you. That was my original inclination, but we're unfortunately seeing something that runs counter to that.
Well, this has been great. Thank you, David and Aaron. I really appreciate all of your great thinking that you shared with us today. And thanks so much to everyone for the questions. I think I hand over to Jamie for the big drawing.